When you have people that are, when these developers are really very, very great developers, every one of them has written a book, right? And I'm in awe just being able to work with these guys. But sometimes it's like that when you deal with people that are usually in 99% of the cases right. And now they're discussing about an issue. Who of them is right? Thank God we didn't end up in a fight yet. That's still to come. But what is great, nobody is the smartest in the room.
ColdFusion Alive, the podcast for the ColdFusion community. Discover practices, tools, techniques, tips and trends for modern ColdFusion development. Brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Here is your host, the founder of TerraTech, Michaela Light.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Gert Franz, all the way from Switzerland.
Can't hear you anymore. Oh, there you go. Now you're...
All right, I'll start over.
Okay.
All right, I'll go bang, just so Paul can cut it. Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Gert Franz, and we're going to be talking about cool new stuff in Lucee CFML, including GigaByte file parsing and asynchronous logging to the database and mail listeners, query listeners, all kinds of cool things you can do in Lucee these days, and catch up with what he's been up to. So welcome, Gert.
Hello, and thank you for having me back. I guess it was a year or so, right?
Yes, it's been nearly a year. It's far too long. I mean, you must get up to so many things. So if you don't know who Gert is, he's heavily involved in the Lucee open source ColdFusion project. And since he was an astrophysicist, he decided he must do something more complicated and decided to start writing a ColdFusion application server.
Well, just to correct you, I was never an astrophysicist, even though I studied that. But I never worked a single day. I never worked a single day as an astrophysicist. Only maybe in my free time when I pull out my telescope. That's when I maybe go back to those days. But I'm a programmer by heart. From the bottom of my heart since the last day I was in uni, or even before that, since I was 15 years old. Started with BASIC,
Wow.
And I remember even the first day that I saw a computer program. That was in 84. It was in 84. But I remember the day because I was watching over the shoulder of a guy, and he was showing me something complex and what it was actually doing, and I was flabbergasted. And the first thing that I remember in 84 that I was able to do was I managed our text printer to print out graphics, right? Ooh. Graphics not being consisting just of characters, but what you had to do, you had to modulate the characters and kind of plot them there, and I was able to do some kind of charts with that. And I was very, very proud being 16 or 17 years of age and programming on Snyder.
And that was
CPC
only a few years ago,
computers.
because you're now 21, right?
I'm 21, yes. I hope I never grow up.
In Hex, right?
In Hex. Well, no, in Hex I am. In the meantime, I'm 34, right? So that is
34.
Nice again. But still, in my head, I'm 15 Hex. Right, or what is it? 15, I guess. 21. Or yeah.
So you're in charge of the development department at DistroKid, which is a music distribution company.
Yes.
So you're doubly cool kid, because not only do you program in Lucee, but you also work at a music company. So,
well, it's always so funny when you're in the meetings with these cool kids from the creative department. They sometimes sit in the meetings with their guitars, and when they're on mute, you see that they're playing and even maybe singing and listening to whatever we're saying. So that is really very cool. And I can tell them, well, while you're talking, I'm just typing a cool program or whatever. That's not cool, or drawing something. But it is a lot cooler if somebody asks me, well, where are you working now? Well, I work in the music industry. That sounds a lot cooler, right? But still, we're programming. We're programming fully with Lucee, and I really love this job. It's hopefully the last job that I'll ever have. And I haven't said that about any job before, right? And I still consider it being my dream job after 2 years of being with DistroKid now. And I took the team from being 2 guys to now 16 developers.
16 developers?
Yes,
wow.
16 developers. And many of them are very, very well known. Mark Drew, for one, Matt Gifford, Nolan Erck, Emily Meyer, formerly Christiansen, Misha, obviously Igal Safir, Misha being one of the core developers of Lucee, and Igal, one of the core developers as well of Lucee. I can tell you honestly, it's not always easy because, it's herding cats. When you have people that are, when these developers are really very, very great developers, every one of them has written a book, right? And I'm in awe just being able to work with these guys. But sometimes it's like that when you deal with people that are usually in 99% of the cases right. And now they're discussing about an issue. Who of them is right? Thank God we didn't end up in a fight yet. That's still to come. But what is great, nobody is the smartest in the room, right? All of them everyone is smarter than you on a particular subject. Maybe some subject, something about certain things, but always you can learn something. And that is really, really awesome. That is what I love about this job so much, is that I'm not at the end of the line. I can still learn stuff, a lot of stuff that I can learn there.
This podcast is brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Get detailed show notes on today's episode and your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at terratech.com. That is TerraTech.com. And now back to today's show.
Who is not really a guy with Lucee background, he decided that we're going to go full stack Lucee, right? We had Nginx now, and we had Node.js and PHP in the mix. But now we're slowly phasing them out, which is great. And it's going to be full Lucee from A to Z. And this is really cool because now everyone could fix any part of the whole system. We're using things like Bitbucket and pipelines, and using Lucee CFML with Ortis CommandBox in the pipeline deployment scripts, which is very great. Thanks and kudos to Mark, who set that up. And it's really, every deploy is one click away. And we're doing test-driven development, and every feature never goes out untested, things like that. And DistroKid itself is the largest music distributor in the world. So more than 50% of the music goes, I suppose, over Lucee's servers, right? And that is really very, very impressive. And I'm very, very happy and very proud of being part of this cool team, especially because it's very chilled and very relaxed. It's not pressure. There are no egos in the mix. Well, sometimes, but I mean, this is what happens when you deal with such famous people. But having the opportunity of using Lucee at its full power at DistroKid is really something very, even relaxing, I would say, because it shows me that the full potential of Lucee, even dealing under pressure of having, I don't know, sometimes we have even a couple of hundred users at the same per second on the servers. And the servers don't really choke about this. Right? Everything runs on Amazon AWS machines, and we're having autoscaling in place, which is, of course, helpful.
How many servers are in the cluster?
Something between 10 and 40 or whatever. Depends on how much is going on the system. Right?
So it also scales up to more servers when you need them.
If needed. We usually don't need that many because it's just Lucee being so performant, right? And if you have a slow website, you can't just say your shop is big just because you have 40 servers running. For me, a page that is slower than, let's say, 2-3 seconds is worth performance tuning, right? And maybe, as you know from my past, I am the guy who does the most stuff in performance tuning, especially in Lucee and databases. And it is a little frustrating because, if the pages are fast already, what do you want to tune? There is nothing to tune. There are some pages that we need to improve a lot, yes, and we're working on those, but those are mostly larger changes that we need to make to the system. I've done a couple of performance talks in my past, and one of the main important things about performance tuning is performance tuning, yes, next to doing all the usual mistakes of using select star or having the wrong indexes or let's assume that everything that you have done is covered by the usual performance recommendations that you have, not using too large lists and what have you. But once you have done that, that's when the interesting part starts. And one thing that I took away from the last 25 years of doing performance tuning and all things is you need to know your data. Once you know your data, you know exactly how to performance tune certain things, right? So, for example, one of the things that we're doing is we're parsing large files which contain information about song usage, like for stats, etc.
When you say large, what do you mean? A megabyte?
Several gigabytes.
Gigabytes?
Yes.
Wow,
yes.
like 20 gigabytes?
Yeah, ish, yes.
Wow.
Depends on what we're, of course, querying there. And there, it is important if you do so for example, if some provider of data is sending you his data from his system, the data in his system is mostly mapped to his internal IDs, right? There might be some global IDs there. So, for example, in music, it's the so-called International Standard Recording Code, ISRC. That is how you identify a song being that song, right? And this ISRC is global and unique per song, or it should be unique. And that is maybe the only thing that is identical in the data that you get from a provider versus your own data. Now, if you want to translate that, which is a character, and you don't want to have primary keys as characters, well, depending, of course, on the size. But if you want to map those, what you have to do is you have to maybe read everything into a table and then do an inner join and try to figure out what ISRC is matching to your own ISRC in your local database. And that can take ages, really ages. So one of the things that I, for example, did in Lucee is I used a feature of queries where you can return a query as a struct, not as a query, but as a struct. You do a CF query, and then you use the attribute return type equals struct. So what I do is I read all the 4 million ISRCs that we have and our internal IDs into a Lucee struct. And whenever I read the file from the external provider, I can just do a simple struct lookup. Well, give me that ISRC, and then I have all the IDs in there. In the end, this proves to be a lot faster than doing that on the database side, because you need to write everything to the database first, and then you need to do the updates on millions of records. And that sometimes can be very, very slow.
Doesn't that take up a lot of memory, though, on the server? Having millions of records in a struct?
Absolutely, it does. So that's why what I do is I only take the most popular 50,000 or popular 500,000, which cover usually about 90% of the data, right? Not all the songs are equally popular. So you take the most popular 500,000 songs, and then that gets you through 90% of the data. And the rest 100%, the rest 10%, you can do the lookups in the database, but that is not that tragic, right? Because you would lose a lot of memory for the last 10% of the data there, right? Sometimes you have one ISRC being referenced once in one line, and I wouldn't want to use memory for that one. But if you have a very popular song, you might have 50,000 lines with that same ISRC. So having that one in your memory already covers 500,000 or 50,000 rows in your file that you're reading in.
I see. So you're optimizing the code by, the most frequently accessed stuff goes to memory, and then if that fails, it goes off to the database to do a query.
But for that you need to know your data, right? You cannot just generalize performance tuning. If you really want to do specific things, then you need to know your data. And then you need to know exactly what to do in order to get the last ounce out of it. But just to give you an example, we had the first iteration that we had, which I think was never live, but the first iteration that we have in order to read, 20 gigs of file into the database and updating it with everything took about, no lying, 2 weeks, right? So we have huge databases, so don't get me wrong. And after we have performance tuned it, after it came to my desk and I was looking through it, the end result was 2 hours, right? So from 2 weeks to 2 hours, it's quite an improvement, right? And
you had a ColdFusion template that took 2 weeks to run? Is that what you said?
Yes.
But that's quite a slow-running template.
Yeah, but it's going through a couple of steps. So what you do is run this. When it's done, run that. When it's done, run that. So it's not one template that does it. So there were several things.
And how does that work? How does that work, Gert, if the server has a crash in the middle of that 2 weeks?
That's why it's great that Lucee has something called tasks. Lucee tasks are things like when you send out an email with Lucee, what you can do is you can just write a CF mail. And if you're using the task feature in Lucee, then this is written to a file and that file gets executed. Now, if that execution is failing, it will retry after a certain amount of time, right? And this is what Lucee tasks are for. Even if the server crashes and it comes back up, that file is still there. Once the file has been executed, it's going to be deleted, right? Obviously, if the file system goes haywire, then obviously you have an issue. But that is very rare happening. What you can do then is you could, for example, move the Lucee file system into Redis, for example, or into Memcached, into a distributed Memcached or a data grid. I mean, just giving an example here. But there are ways around this so that these things don't crash. But saying that it takes 2 weeks was just an example where we started. And in the end, we ended up with 2 hours in one template, right? And everything written in an object-oriented approach, which is sometimes what there is important is if you want to really squeeze out every single ounce of whatever you want to do. Sometimes what I've done is, this was a very good and very neat trick. I'm doing this ingestion of large files for different file formats. So what I have is I have a general CFC, which is then inheriting, or this general CFC is inherited, or several specific CFCs are inheriting the large one, or the main one, which does the heavy lifting. And the specific things are happening in the other classes, so in the classes that are inheriting the other one. So what I did is, in the large class, I had several calls to methods that are empty in the master class because the specific classes didn't need it. They were only needed in certain events. So I was just calling them, even though they did nothing, and just to cover the fact that in a specific case, I needed a specific of these functions. So what I did is I wrote in the init method, I figured out, I read all the methods of my specific class and found out which one is there. And I converted the call into an if call. If that method is there, call it. If not, skip it. And just that if, converting that method call, which is a local method call in the same CFC, to an if, sped up the code by a lot, right? So it took maybe, let's say, 2 hours and 15 minutes, and now it takes 2 hours. 15 minutes doesn't sound like a lot, but if you continue at that pace, you end up maybe even having negative time. Well, just but you get
You're
time
going
back
back to your
as soon as you
astrophysics days inside your black holes.
yeah, before you hit the return button, the result is already there, right? So that would be.
I'm kind of curious how Lucee does the CF looping on a file. Is it sucking the whole file into memory, or is it only bringing one line at a time, or what? How does that work?
So there is what you can do in Lucee, and that is in ColdFusion available as well. You can do CFLoop File equals, and then you point to a text file or a CSV file or whatever, and then every time, so the loop goes line by line. And Lucee supports index and item. That supports it for a while already. So index contains the line number and item contains the line. And then usually what you would do is something like list to array, right? So you have a separator, which is pipe or tab or semicolon or comma. And then you would just get an array of values. And then you do with those values whatever you want to do. And you can do start line and end line and stuff like that, which works quite nice. But looping through a 20 gigabyte file is quite time consuming. So just running through the file with CFLoop File takes up to, I would say, 2 minutes, just looping through that file, moving the pointer on the file.
But it doesn't take 20, if it's a 20 gigabyte file, it doesn't suck up 20 gigabytes of memory, right?
No, not at all. This used to be, one of the first approaches, which has been done in 2013, 14, when DistroKid was very small, and we only had, 50 kilobytes of files. What we did is CFFILE action read it into a string, and do a list to array, separated by carriage returns. And then you had all the lines, and then you looped through the lines, and then you did a list to array of each individual line, which is very bad. You should never deal with lists unless they are smaller than 200 items, maybe. And so looping through a file is really just consuming the amount of memory you need for one line. If it's just that, CFLoop file, index item, index item, line, then line is everything that you will read for each iteration through that loop. Now, while this was fast, still 20 or 2 minutes or 1 minute for looping through a 20 gigabyte file is quite long. And in addition, there were some transformations necessary, like, for example, look up stuff, validate stuff, etc., bring it into a certain form. And depending on what file type it is, for example, if it is from YouTube or from Spotify or from Apple, different positions were important. So you had to do a lot of assignments. So what you could do is you could run through all the files, all the columns, and just say, okay, if it's Apple, use this one. If it's Spotify, use that one. So, but that is not performant enough. So one thing that I did is I created a configuration file, and that configuration file, there I just said, okay, for Apple, what column is at what position? And then I generated a CFM file, which just said, position 5, this is the ISRC. Position 2 is title, etc. And that was a flat file. And including that flat file is much faster than having a loop going over all the columns and just doing all those things. So there are very, very many small things that you can do to squeeze out inches of performance. But with all of those applied, we got from, from 2 weeks to, I would say, 6 hours. But now with introducing something that Misha wrote into Lucee, a function called parseDSV. ParseDSV is a Java written function which you call parseDSV, you pass in the file, and then as a second argument, you pass in a component or an instance of a component. And that component has several methods. So for example, header, OnHeader, OnBody, OnFooter. And OnBody, for example, has a step method, so or a batch size method, or I don't know what it's called. But you could say, for example, always call this method on 1,000 lines. So after Java has parsed 1,000 lines, it calls this method OnBody and passes in a query which contains 1,000 records, right? Already parsed and already matched, and etc. So, for example, another issue that we had was what is if you have quoted delimiters? So, for example, a song name might have a comma in there, right? And the separator is a comma, right? Then you would end up having the wrong number of columns if you're doing a list to array. So what you have to do is you have to have quoted commas in there, and you need to discover the quotes. And all of this written in CFML just takes a lot of time. So we decided to move that part of parsing to Java. And then we went from 6 hours to 2 hours or 3 hours. And now with the additional couple of things that we have introduced, we went down to 2 hours, which is great, right? But
that's
given
amazing.
Given the fact that these files are growing by about a gigabyte each month, I'm sure we have to do some more performance tuning in a couple of months. But
so, I mean, just for folks who don't know how long a week is, it's 168 hours. So 2 weeks is 336 hours. And you went from 336 hours to 2 hours. So it's 150 times faster.
Yes.
Yeah, yes. That's a big improvement. So now you mentioned to me before we got on the call, there's some other cool features in Lucee using asynchronous logging to the database.
Yes.
That was one, and some listeners were some of the others. So tell us about how you're using asynchronous logging and why that's cool.
Well, for example, what you want to do is when somebody goes on a certain page, you may be next to the whole logging to Elk and logging to Loggly or whatever we're doing. You want to have some statistics on what users are using for other reasons, for other purposes. Of course, we have Google Analytics and all of these things. But sometimes you want to use the data in your application for certain things. When did you last time go to that page or whatever? So if you want to log something on every single request, you would have loads of insert into a table on every single request. And if you have 300 people on the same side, on the site every second, that turns into a massive amount of insert statements that you would have to perform. So we came up with the solution of doing an asynchronous logging. And how we do that is by just taking the query and adding it to a stack. And that stack then is going to be inserted in a batch of 100 or a batch of 1,000. Right, and this is we first tried to do that with an async equals true, which CF query allows us to do, but that actually just moved the problem from being visible on the site, so it took a little longer until the page is loaded, to something happening in the background. We are now using asynchronous equals true if something on the site happens and we know that there is a longer update query necessary before the user can move on. Like, for example, if you need to update some data that the user has, and you know that you need to do a lot of lookup, and you don't want the user to wait until the whole process is working. Now, there is the disadvantage. If you, for example, do that in a CF thread, you can do that. You have an additional work that you need to do, CF thread out, and then do all your work, and at the end you maybe send an email if things go wrong, or notify the user somehow differently. But if you break out into an asynchronous execution of a query, the issue is that you don't know, was it successful or not, right? And therefore, Lucee supports, next to the async attribute of CF query and query execute, we support listeners. And listeners allow you to pass in listener equals component instance, and that component instance needs to have things like on error, on before execute, on after execute, or on after and on before. I think that's what the methods are called. And then you can do your own thing in there. For example, on before, you could even manipulate the SQL. This is sometimes necessary. For example, if you know that you're on a test machine, you maybe don't want to post to certain tables. I mean, there are always different kinds of scenarios. I'm now making things up, but For example, for another client, what we had is that we were, our Lucee application was one of the applications that used a data warehouse. And since the data warehouse, we had to pay for slots in the data warehouse. The owners of the data warehouse budget needed to know which application uses how much of the resources so that we can assign the funds used to the according budgets. And in order to do that, every of our single individual queries needed to have a header. Now, how do you do that by not having to go and change all the queries in all the source codes? You could, of course, do that per specific data source connection. But what we decided to do is use a query listener. And we defined a global query listener to this data source that was using that data warehouse. And in the onBefore method, we just manipulated the SQL by inserting the header before. And that header just described the author of this SQL statement. And it's very, very handy because you can react on errors as well. And you could log something, send out an email, or whatever. So query listeners are not the only ones. We also have mail listeners where you can onBefore mail send, on mail send, and stuff like that. Right. So this is what we were using it for, especially handling large amounts of data sets and long running queries in the background so that the user sees the page immediately, but the effects are stored in the background.
So just so I'm clear, these asynchronous queries is any SQL query that's being run, whether it's logging, analytics, or
could be even a select statement, which maybe makes no sense, but yes, anything.
Wow.
Obviously, you need to be a little careful with transactions because the transactions might break when you're doing something in an asynchronous way. So if you're inside a CF transaction, I'm not really sure how this now works, but it could be that is not possible inside of a CF transaction tag.
Okay. And then you have a listener for the CF mail tag as well. Is that what I understood?
Yes. Exactly.
So before the mail gets sent, you can run some checks, or you can run, if an error happens sending it, you can.
Yeah. So for example, what we have, this is also for a client of ours, what we have written there. And if we're sending out emails to certain users, there needs to be a certain or a different header in the subject for mails if it's coming from the test server, right? And we didn't want to make specific changes for, okay, use this subject or whatever. Now we just created a listener for mail. And in the onBefore, we just figured out, are you on the test server? Yes, then add that or put a prefix to your email subject so that it is working like that. So that is really, really fun.
Well, that's cool. Are there any other listeners in Lucee, or?
I think we're creating additional listeners pretty soon. I don't know, maybe on HTTP. You know, we have things like caching that we've introduced to functions, to files, even to HTTP calls to web services. So the cool thing is when you're using Lucee, and I use Lucee every day, you sometimes detect the need for new things. And sometimes we just say, okay, let's rewrite Lucee or extend Lucee. And what we did is we created a DistroKid extension, which we use at DistroKid, because some things make sense only for DistroKid, and some things make sense to the wide community. And if
how does that work? Is that a fork of Lucee, or you kind of apply a patch to the local version?
No, Lucee allows you to create extensions. You know, I don't know if you've ever seen that. In Lucee, an extension is called LEX, so Lex. And what you can do, so for example, the PDF extension, if you don't want to use PDFs, you can just install the bare minimum of Lucee, which is, I guess, 21 megabytes. And that doesn't contain anything, right? It just allows you to execute Lucee to connect to your H2 database. And even if you want to connect to MySQL, you need to install the MySQL extension, right? because you don't need to carry around all the weight of other things. So why not just have a very, very slimmed down Lucee version? So I guess CommandBox, for example, the smallest version of CommandBox doesn't contain anything. So no PDF extension, no image manipulation extension, all of those things. We have about, I don't know, I would say about 25 to 30 extensions that you can choose to opt in or opt out. But what we created is we created a Lucee extension, or a Lucee DistroKid extension, which contains the things that we wanted to have changed. So additional functionality that we use in Lucee or at DistroKid with Lucee, but are not yet ready for the public, or are just too specific for DistroKid so that it is not going out. So for example,
does that mean certain functions and tags work differently in your code base than they would for other people?
No, they're just additional ones, right?
Oh, additional features. Okay, it's not overwriting. You're not overwriting the existing function. Extensions don't let you. Extensions don't let you do that.
We could do that. We could extend certain functionality, but we mostly use it to create new functionality. Like, for example, we have a function list to struct. Now, you might think list to struct makes no sense, but what you could do is you could just say, here is my list of columns that I read from a file, and I would like to have it return a struct which contains the column name and the value, right? So you pass in a list of column names and the list of values, and that is assigned to a struct.
Cool. Right. So anyone can create these, and they're written in CFML or in Java.
They can be written. They can be written in CFML. They can be written in Java. So one company that I know does their deployment with Lucee extensions, because what you can do is you can write your Lucee extensions completely in CFML and bundle them into a Lex file, which then deploys to the web root, right? So the Lucee extension contains several subfolders. One subfolder is, for example, the lib folder, and the lib folder contains bundles of jar files that are then deployed into the Lucee web container or a server container, and are then necessary maybe to execute that extension. Then we have the TLD, tag library descriptor. The tag library descriptor contains the structure of the new tag that you may be introducing. Or we have the FLD, which is the function library descriptor, which describes the new function that you're defining for your Lucee instance. Or you have /applications, and /applications inside this Lex file is deployed to the web root. So what you can do is you can deploy your complete application as one single file, as a Lex file, and throw that into the deploy folder in the Lucee webinf directory, and that gets deployed to your environment. Right? Some people do it like that because this allows you to version your extensions.
Wow, that's really cool. Now, you mentioned that the minimum install on Lucee is 21 megs, so I'm assuming that's really useful if you have a auto-scaling cloud deployment of your app, because it can load up Lucee really fast. How many seconds does it take to load Lucee at the minimum?
Well, on my Mac, for example, it takes about 2 seconds, but I'm still not happy because CommandBox heavily depends on how fast Lucee is starting up. And that is one of the features that we're working on for Lucee 6, is that the startup time will be somewhere below half a second, right? So that you finally can use, so that you finally can use CommandBox really like that in even a shell script without a large delay. So that is one of the major focuses on Lucee 6. As far as I remember, but that's one of my focuses that I want to put an emphasis on. For us at DistroKid, it's not so important how fast it starts up, because we are going towards the blue-green deployment, where you're first deploying to the green servers, wait until they're up and warmed up, and then you switch the load balancer to point to the new servers, and then you upgrade the other ones. Right. So that
Okay.
is targeted where how we're doing that.
Okay. And then the other thing I think you mentioned you've been using in your code base is you've got a way to get CF tags into CF script. Can you tell us
Yes.
about that?
Since you know it yourself, we are veteran CFML developers, and amongst the veteran CFML developers, there are some that just love writing in tag, right? And sometimes there are tags like CF query, CF mail, which are already, as soon as you open and close the CF mail or CF output, a CF query tag, you're already in output mode, right? So you could just use hash, for example, in queries, and you don't need to write CF output and put a hash in there. Or functions, for example, are like that. And the problem there is that if you want to convert that into a proper tag version of a script version of the tag, it's not really possible, because in Lucee you can always write every single tag that is in CF tag. You can convert that into a regular tag by just taking away the open bracket CF and the closing one, and just use take away the CF and put a curly bracket at the end, a curly braces at the end and at the bottom of the CF loop or CF tag or whatever it is.
That's true for all the tags.
All the tags, yes.
Wow.
But still, if you use that for query, you still need to do something like echo in there within the SQL code. So that's why there are things like query execute or the query notation for a script. But what you can do, and this is also very helpful, if you have people that are reluctant to move to CF script, you can give them a way out by allowing them to use CF query inside CF script by just introducing a tag block in CF script with triple backticks. Right, this is the usual notation for wikis. That you have the triple backticks for code. And it is also useful when you, for example, write CFML code to generate front-end output, right? Like divs and LIs and whatever. And sometimes you get into problems there with single or double quotes. So going into the tag mode allows you to just start off by having, already script that is output or stuff that you just already output. And it's also very helpful to convert people to use more scripted versions of their code. Script is very good for preventing output. That is the main goal of using CF script versus using tag. Tag is way more verbose, so you have more to write, and it generates way more output than script. Script doesn't generate any output at all. That's why.
So you're talking about all those. Are you talking about blank lines that appear in the output, or something else? Okay.
Tabs.
I always wondered where those
lines
came from.
But just imagine if you're in a regular CFML template and you write a CF loop from 1 to 10, and then next line you indent the line by a tab. How should your HTML know that tab is not intended, right? So it needs to be there. It is absolutely clear that every single carriage return or tab needs to appear, because HTML has no idea that it's not supposed to output that. But in CF script, you deliberately choose to output something. And that's why in ColdFusion, you have these crutches like enable CF output only. This is just only to prevent whitespace. Or you have the whitespace management, which prevents everything from being outputted if it's not inside a CF output. Or the smart whitespace management, which takes every whitespace that is followed by a whitespace and removes it. But all of these are really poor solutions for a problem which is coming with the tag notation itself. So why not?
Yeah, why not avoid it in the first place? And also, I think it just looks like more modern code if it's in script.
And it allows many people coming over from JavaScript, from Java, from other languages, which look very, very similar.
Yeah, exactly. And that was my next question. I know Adobe ColdFusion are trying to make their CF script 100% compatible with ECMAScript. And I just wondered, is that something Lucee is doing too, or it already is, basically the same as an ECMAScript, for those who don't know, is basically what the JavaScript standard.
Let me put it this way. I don't know whether that will drive so many people towards using ColdFusion in general. In my opinion, it has way more to do with how Adobe presents themselves online. Which of their websites is powered by ColdFusion? Not a single one, right? Or at least maybe the ColdFusion website or their blog or whatever. But if you want to make something big, it's not only by the features, it's about adoption. It's about adoption by somebody big, by somebody like Facebook or, I don't know, Twitter or whoever. If they would use CFML, I guess people wouldn't really 100% care about whether it is now ECMAScript compatible or not. I mean, CF script is not so far away from ECMAScript, right? There are a couple of specific things that are there as well. And I totally commend Adobe for making CF script 100% ECMAScript compatible. And I'm pretty sure we're going to follow that road as well. But I don't think that that's going to bring so many people towards using ColdFusion. We actually have that in Lucee as well. There is the mode in Lucee where you can make Lucee, I don't even know how we called it. We once wanted to write HTMLX. HTMLX would have been HTML and JavaScript, but with Lucee features, right? Instead of CFMail, you would have just written mail. Instead of CFIF, you would just have written if. That was the idea. And that still works in Lucee. It is, I guess, starting with a colon or an underline. I'm not sure. You can enable that in Lucee, but it is a hidden feature. And the same goes for the scripted version of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And we have an additional, I'm sorry to say, but I have forgotten the name of how it was called. It is about 2 years back when we, well, it's not discontinued. It still works. And because we have test cases for that. But what we have there is, for example, that Lucee has the strict mode. So meaning that you always have to scope your URL variables or your form variables or your client variables or your query variables. All of them need to be scoped if you have this mode enabled. Or other things that this has an effect on is the casing of structures, of key structures. In ColdFusion, by default, they're uppercase. In Lucee, you can set an admin flag that they maintain their case of how they have been defined. And in this Lucee strict mode, we would have that by default. Or in methods, in any function, you always have to var your variables that are unknown. Otherwise, they're out in the outside variable scope. And in the strict mode, that would be by default. Right? So there are many things that we have introduced there, which are kind of going in the same direction as Adobe does. But at the moment, I don't think that is the thing that is driving people towards Adobe.
What is driving people towards Lucee or Adobe ColdFusion? Just to make it manufacturer agnostic.
Love.
Why do people move to ColdFusion, do you feel?
I don't think that they're moving to ColdFusion. There may be sometimes somebody else convinces them with their own passion and love about why they're using Lucee or ColdFusion. It's just like a drug sometimes, like religion, because once you're hooked, you may be not going away that fast, and you are very reluctant to go back to anything else because it is just so nice and beautiful to use. And I still love working with it. I've worked with other languages as well, but still, not only because I'm part of the Lucee core team, but I just like programming with it. I remember first time I saw CFML, I thought, what the hell is this? And it's so backwards, and it's generating so much output, and it's so ugly, tag-based. I was coming from the Java world and Delphi world, and for me, having non-typed variables was very, very unusual. But in the meantime, it's the center of my life, my professional life, at least. Right, and I still live it.
Yeah, it's interesting you describe, which language people pick as almost a religion, because it does seem to, people don't always look at the facts of how easy it is to code in something, or, what it truly costs as opposed to what it seems to cost. And, I was talking with a CIO the other month, and he was talking about .NET because, famously .NET is free, but just by the way, you've got to spend thousands or tens of thousands of dollars on Microsoft Windows servers and Microsoft SQL Server enterprise licenses and the whole ecosystem. I mean, I don't want to accuse Microsoft of, as being similar to drug dealers, but you know how drug dealers sometimes give out free samples to hook you in to their drug ecosystem. And it's almost like, that's how .NET is set up. They say it's free, and they have lots of free resources, which is great. But like once they've sucked you in, boy, do they want you to write big checks.
Still, I think having VS Code is one of the greatest things that I ever did. I just love VS Code. And but I totally agree with you. And for me, the reason why I think this is more or less like religion is because the thing that you are very good at, you don't want to give up. And many of the people that I know are very good at CFML, and we brought on board a couple of the greatest minds in our realm, and they are all sharing the passion. And you can see if somebody knows something very well, he's passionate about it, and he can talk for hours about the same thing and even bore people to death about well, he's starting again with that. Yes, but that shows the passion that people have. And I have that passion. I have the passion for Lucee for a very long time. And I can understand people having the same passion for other languages. I'm not saying another language is bad or good. Nowadays, it doesn't really almost matter which language you're using because they're all compiling down to the same thing. Some might be a little more flexible. Some might be a little more fancy, have some better documentation. But in the end, they're almost all quite the same. And having the core team being part of the team that I am in gives me a lot of confidence in what we are using. And
well, I think that's true that, most computer languages let you do most things. I mean, they're all, whatever that, I forget the phrase, they're
jack of all trades.
What is it? Finite state machines or...
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean, I can use a screwdriver to pound a nail into a wall, but probably a hammer would do the job better,
So, that is true, but there are different hammers, right?
Yeah, sometimes you want a sledgehammer, sometimes you want a little hammer. Yeah. So I think each language, has a sweet spot where it's good at. There's a lot of overlap, like you say, where it doesn't, you could use this language or that language. There is a question of how fast can you get the job done, and CFML generally is really fast. I mean,
yes,
if you have a manual screwdriver versus you've got one of those electric drill screwdrivery things, you can get a lot more screws in with the electric drill screwdriver.
That is true.
And sometimes,
I
ColdFusion
totally agree.
Generally is less lines of code and faster to write the code.
And
also, agree. I would say faster to debug. So let's wrap up by talking about why you're proud to use CFML these days.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can give you the same answer I guess I gave you the last time, because I'm part of CFML and I'm part of shaping the future as well of CFML, and hopefully to give it some long years. And as you said, allowing me to do my job very prolific and very efficient. That is why I love CFML.
Well, I mean, ColdFusion, I was going to say CFML has been around for 25 years. Actually, it was DBML for those of us who remember how it started off. But it really was CFML. They just had a different tag prefix back then. And I'm sure it'll be around for another 25 years at least, if not more. I mean, who knows what's going to be happening in 2045, probably will be still all locked down from this crazy situation. No, I'm just kidding there. I hope we're not still locked down from this crazy situation. But what do you think it would take to make ColdFusion Lucee even more alive this year, Gert?
Unfortunately, the conferences are a little missing. Talking about it more, sharing the passion, sharing the love. And that is what I encourage people to do. What I noticed very often is that many people don't show up at conferences, never heard of conferences, never heard of podcasts, never heard of meetups, even virtual meetups. They just are there in their 9-to-5s, and they never raise an eyebrow and never look above their horizon. And that is something that we can hopefully bring people with our passion to look out for other fellow CFML programmers, because of many we don't know.
It's like the dark matter of the ColdFusion universe.
I can imagine. Yes, I can imagine. And it's
just
really
to bring in some
like
astrophysics.
Thank you.
But why do you think some? It's hard to tell how many CFers are silent, because they're silent, we don't know they exist. Hence the phrase dark matter. But
yes.
I mean, we know from the number of downloads of Lucee that there are many more people using Lucee than talk about Lucee.
Yeah, that is true.
I mean, 100 times as many, right? Or
yeah, well, I would say, no, I wouldn't say 100 times as many. But for example, if you take the average people that are verbose, that are speaking out, of being maybe, I don't know, known people, 300, 400 people that are speaking actively about it, I think 100 times might hit the number. I think that might hit the number. In the best days of Rilo, I remember we had around 80 to 100,000 people that were downloading, individual IP addresses that I know that were downloading Lucee. And we even did once a check of all the websites that are out there. Just need to go in a couple of minutes. A couple of websites that are out there, seeing on which engine they are, and we came to a similar number of individual server IP addresses.
Maybe we'll talk. You've got another meeting you have to go to, so but I'd love to come back to this topic of how to encourage people who are just listening to this podcast but never tweet or blog or whatever to do that. So. Anyway, if people want to find you online, what are the best ways for them to do that?
Well, just send me an email. Go to my LinkedIn profile.
What's your email?
My email, gert@rasia.ch or gert@distrokid.com, whichever you want to use. I'm actually not that present on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram or any of these other things. It's just me being maybe lazy, and I know that once I'm on them, I will not stop talking or stop browsing or stop doing things. For me, it's a time sink. So that's why I stay away from them. And it doesn't put me in the jeopardy of tweeting something stupid like others.
You'd never tweet anything stupid.
Come on.
Far too much.
My wife thinks otherwise.
Oh, well. Yes.
No. Just kidding.
All right. Well, I appreciate you coming so much on the show. Good luck with Lucee 6 when that launches. We'll let people know about that. And I'd love to have you and some of the other Lucee luminaries, if that's the right phrase, come on the show and tell us more about the cool features coming out in the next version.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you very much for having me, and talk to you soon. Take care.
Get detailed show notes on today's episode in your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at teratech.com. That is teratech.com. Viva la CF Alive Revolution!